This report is grappling with what I think is one of our major security challenges, which is how do we counter egregious behavior, whether it's ethnic cleansing or dangerous nuclear proliferation, without resorting to war. Diplomacy backed by force is a very old tool, probably as old as war and diplomacy themselves. The United States, though, since the onset of the Cold War, has developed a practice of coercive diplomacy, of trying to use the threat of force without actually using it to achieve international security goals, to alter the behavior of an adversary. Now, there are ways you can enhance your chances of success, as we've learned through the practice of U.S. coercive diplomacy. Obviously, setting realistic aims in the first place. Well, what's realistic? Well, that means you have a great deal of intelligence, hopefully, and understanding how much can you realistically achieve if you put so much pressure on an adversary. Secondly, trying to deny the adversary the belief that time is on his side. Because an adversary will do everything he can to squeeze out away from the pressure. And if he thinks he can, over time, continue to do that, to weave and tack and avoid the pressure, well, then he will never really want to make a deal. Thirdly, to make the punishment credible, which is why sometimes threatening a regime's survival may be necessary for diplomacy. This is a very controversial point, because how do you do that? How do you tell the adversary that his personal regime is threatened, but you convey to the key members of the international community, including important neighboring states, for instance, that the United States is not seeking regime change. It may lead to regime change, but that's not necessarily the goal. Fourthly, complementing penalties with inducements, as Alexander George suggested, keeping a very positive path of incentives on the table. And fifthly, being prepared to follow through, because ultimately, if you're not prepared to follow through, you really haven't thought through clearly your aims and the probability of success. I would argue that economic coercive statecraft is a poster child for smart power, and that these two case studies are the best instances we have to see how to better use them for challenges that we have today and tomorrow.
It was a real honor to have a chance to tell the story of the sanctions that were imposed on Serbia and how they were developed and fine-tuned. To put into the report a good description of how these sanctions developed, of the loopholes that we discovered along the way, and the actions that we took to close them. But another key lesson that I think should be drawn from the experience is a recognition that sanctions are not themselves a magic bullet, that they need to be, the decision to apply them needs to be taken wisely in a circumstance where they can have an appropriate impact, that they need to be designed to achieve the objectives that we are seeking to achieve, and that we need to keep in mind the minimization of any collateral damage that's not intended. I think those are key to any effective sanctions program. Too much in the past we've relied on a one-size-fits-all approach. Measures have been adopted by the Security Council in the past. It's very easy, therefore, to go back to the Security Council and say, adopt the same set of measures against some other target country, although the situation may be quite different. The unique factor, I think, with the Serbia sanctions is that they were designed to deal with Serbia, and they were customized along the process. And that, I think, is an essential element for any sanctions program today. Iran, North Korea, require that kind of an approach. And what we did with respect to the Serbia sanctions and how we've reflected them in this report will help keep in mind these factors, and will help us in furthering our processes to make the sanctions tool an effective tool. We have to ask ourselves each time, are sanctions the right answer? And then we have to ask the second question, are the sanctions that we've adopted the sanctions that will be effective, and what is necessary to make them effective?
We convened a series of working group meetings, and quite a few of the participants are here in the room today. Through the working group, we came up with a series of recommendations, and several common conclusions emerged. We don't represent them as the consensus of all the members of the group, although I feel that we probably approach that. And I encourage you to take a look at the report's introduction. See, first is in the last decade, things have changed in the world of financial affairs. The Treasury Department has pioneered a new era of financial operations other than war and created what I would consider a revolution in financial affairs, somewhat akin to the revolution in military affairs that has developed with the employment of high technology and precision-guided munitions. The employment of precision-guided financial measures designed to affect the calculations of the private sector to break business ties with targeted entities has opened up a new door for applying pressure against adversaries. And I think this is becoming clear in the Iran case. And in fact, in the reality is, I think from Treasury's perspective, they've barely begun to employ the types of capabilities they've developed. So we should watch that space carefully. A tremendous amount has been placed in the lap of the Department of Treasury. And I just can't say enough good things about our friends at the Treasury. They've done unprecedented things. But there was a consensus in our working group that Treasury was neglecting other instruments of national power that weren't under its legal authorities, including the use of economic sanctions and law enforcement. Treasury does not inherently think interagency and also lacks the sophisticated network analysis, campaign planning, and monitoring capabilities that exist elsewhere. Now, I think that they are developing those capabilities in Treasury, and I applaud that. But if Treasury is going to plan and do financial and economic operations in a broad spectrum, it will need to be better equipped, better empowered, and think more broadly. Otherwise, the NSC or state will need to step up to the plate to the point of high-level pressures are, as we've had in our cases with North Korea and with the Balkans. We can bring the whole government and international partners to bear along with the considerable authorities of the Treasury Department. Third point is that law enforcement remains perhaps the most neglected instrument of international power for the United States. The Department of Justice, Homeland Security, Commerce, and their foreign counterparts should be encouraged to better integrate their efforts and capabilities into a pressure strategy. Law enforcement can be used to apply pressure to the banking system as well. I think one of the single most neglected capabilities in the current Iran sanctions and Iran pressure strategy is the use of law enforcement to actually indict and even arrest financial actors who have been engaged in flagrant and consistent and prolific masking, deception, and misrouting of financial information on behalf of the Iranian government. And these include, I think, as many as 14 different financial institutions internationally that have been looked at by federal law enforcement authorities, in my understanding. And we've had quite a few high-profile settlements with banks, but no one's been held accountable. There haven't been any bankers arrested or indicted. Finally, the use of the USA Patriot Act, Section 311. I'm very grateful that Juan Zarate's joining us. He's the man who really pioneered this in the U.S. government, which empowers the Treasury Department to cut off money laundering banks and domiciles around the world from the U.S. financial system, needs to be revived.